very much, and welcome everybody to this session on the work that Dave and Ranju have been doing recently, and the new book forthcoming, Embodying the Yoga Sutra. I'm going to confess already that I have an interest in this, in that Dave and Ranju have been my teachers for many, many years, and I really value the opportunity to share with you some of the fantastic and erudite and entertaining ways that they can transmit this extraordinary work to new and modern audiences. So first of all, perhaps if we can say welcome to Dave and Ranju. Could you tell us a little bit, please, about this new work that you've done, Embodying the Yoga Sutra?
Yes.
Good. Moving swiftly on.
About 8 or 10 years ago, we started to write a book. Dave and I have been working together and teaching together for probably 15 years or so.
Yeah.
And we run various teacher training courses. We started to write a book 4 years ago. We had got about 2/3 of the way through completing that book, and about 4 years ago, having got 2/3 of the way, we just thought we just need a little final push 4 years ago. And so we did a Kickstarter crowdfunding campaign, and we raised some good. We raised enough for us to feel that we could complete the book, and we basically rewrote that book. So the original book that we had got completely rewritten.
Pretty much started again, didn't we?
And we pretty much started again. And what we've been working with a particular teacher from the. Hold on. Can I just ask a question?
Go ahead. Yeah.
How many of you know the Yoga Sutra? Okay.
Good.
So how many of you are yoga teachers? Okay, so how many of you know nothing about the Yoga Sutra? Excellent.
You came to the right place.
Okay, so we decided to write this book. I mean, there are loads of different translations of the Yoga Sutra. It's an esoteric text from 2,000 years ago, written in this kind of very dense Sanskrit, and it can often be seen as a very academic, not really very relevant. And so we wrote this book for modern audiences, to make it quite accessible and to make it very practice-based.
Yeah, and I think it would be worth us saying that in the way that we have been taught and we've received yoga from Desikachar, teacher based in Chennai, the Yoga Sutra was the heart of how you approached everything. Often these days I think people, certainly in yoga circles, a lot of people have heard of the text, but quite often the text and the practice of yoga are almost like completely divorced, almost as if they're like two completely separate things. And I think one of the things that we were very fortunate about in the way that we were taught is that these two things were linked intricately from the very, very beginning. And I think that's really what we've tried to reflect in what we've done, isn't it?
I think that sometimes the danger is that it's when people learn about yoga, it's like learning PE and philosophy, doing 2 O-levels. Yeah. PE and philosophy with very tenuous links. And hopefully what we've tried to do is to make it one subject. And the title, as you said, the Embodying the Yoga Sutra, is about turning whatever wisdom there was into an embodied practice. Off the mat as well as on the mat.
And then you have this subtitle, which is Support, Direction, Space. Could you talk a little bit about what is the importance of support, direction, space in the
We can.
text?
It is the heart of how we've approached the book, and it's both a very traditional idea and it's also a very innovative idea. We can't claim to be the originators of this sort of way of presenting it. We had the fortune to work with a man called Peter Hersnack, who sadly died just a couple of years ago. But for me, he has been the most brilliant mind that I've met involved in this whole field. And I think he was just a genius at reformulating some traditional ideas in a way that is both radically new and radically relevant, but also very faithful. And I think to do those two things, to sort of be both radically new and to be faithful to tradition, is a very difficult thing to do. And I think that's something that he achieved. And what we've tried to do is use this idea as the heart of how we've approached the whole thing. And it's an approach to practice, it's an approach to the text, it's an approach to the way you live your life, basically.
Could you give an example of...
Yeah. 3 words: support, direction, space. And one of the ideas of those 3 words coming together is when, and this works, I mean, you can think about this working in your own lives in all sorts of contexts, but when you feel that you are well supported, could be in a relationship, could be even having a chair which you feel comfortable to sit in, when you feel well supported, what you can do is let go. You can rely on something to hold you in place when you feel well supported. When you feel well supported, also you are able to move in relationship to that support. So as long as you have freedom in relationship to your support, that's a good place to be. Because if you're glued to your support, then the support becomes a prison. If you are glued to the back of your chair, then it's great while you're sitting, but you are doomed to walk around like a man with lumbago forevermore if you are glued to the chair. So you have to have freedom in relationship to your support. And of course, when you've got good support and you've got a good and freedom in relationship to that support, it can give you a direction. And if you've got a direction, a space opens up between your support and your direction. And I mean, that's a kind of a literal thing with a chair, but think about that in terms of relationship. If you feel well supported in a relationship, it means you can move freely from the basis of that relationship, and that opens up a space. Within yoga postures, what we're working to do is to find, in a yoga posture, stability in order to create movement, in order to open space. So those 3 touchstones we use in many, many arenas, and that's how the yoga postures, for example, can almost become metaphors, or is that the right word, metaphors? They can become kind of symbols of working in different arenas as well. Does that make sense, Steve?
It does. How do you? Perhaps we should clarify. The Yoga Sutra itself is not a book that contains any kind of yoga postures, so it's not a manual on positional yoga. The text that you've produced is not a translation.
No.
Could you maybe talk a little bit about the approach you've taken there?
Yeah, we've selected essentially 16 sutras, which are short verses, out of the 195, and we've sought the verses that we think are most important and relevant for the practice and life today, and we've basically got a chapter on each of those, and we've tried to both translate them. We've explained some of the very traditional ideas about them. So many of those ideas are not very well known in the West within yoga circles, but we've tried to include some very, very traditional ideas, and then we've sought to, in a sense, expand and reframe them in a way that makes them both relevant and accessible to people today. So it's both a technical book and a hopefully understandable book. Practical book, yeah, exactly that. Yeah.
And I think one of the things that we had a lot of fun with is etymology, in as much as you can look at the Yoga Sutras, and I once wrote an article on the Yoga Sutra 10 years ago or more, and I just looked at one of the Yoga Sutra, and it's in Sanskrit, and then I just looked at, I think I copied out in this article 10 different translations into English. So they were extremely variable in what they said. So by just relying on one English translation, you are definitely skewing meaning into particular ways. So what Dave and I have done in considerable detail is to actually look at the Sanskrit, and I don't think you need to be a Sanskrit scholar by any means, or I hope you don't, to get something from this book, because what we've done is to look at the Sanskrit and then look at how that Sanskrit word has been derived and what its meanings are, and then we've kind of fleshed out the meaning of the sutra from the Sanskrit into contemporary English, which means you're not kind of going via translations. We try to be very transparent in the way we have translated it from the root meanings. Yeah.
That would be great. Could you, off the top of your head, just give us an example of that? It would be great to have a...
You could do yucha yucha. Could you?
I could, okay.
Or another one.
Okay, all right. Let's talk about the meaning of the word yoga, for example, which is our subject, obviously. I mean, I think one of the first things to appreciate is that although Sanskrit might seem a very obscure language, English shares its roots with Sanskrit, and so we can often begin to see links between the English and the Sanskrit straight away. So yoga and yoke, for example, are related words. But if you actually go into the etymology of the word yoga, you start to appreciate something about the richness of the Sanskrit tradition, the Indian tradition, and the mechanisms by which they sought to both explore the ideas and also to create teaching. Because one of the things that is commonly done is to analyse the word, analyse the roots of the words, and when we find that in fact often there are many cases where there is more than one root to the word. There are a range of roots. And by exploring all of those, you can actually, it's not so much that there's just one that's correct. One might be primary, but all the others add layers of meaning. And this, it seems to me, is one of the ways that actually it's almost like a teaching technique. It's a teaching mechanism. So most people understand, most yoga teachers or will understand yoga as coming from a root meaning to link or to join.
To yoke, yeah.
To yoke, yeah. And that's a primary way that we can understand the meaning of yoga. But if you look at the Yoga Sutra, it's clear that actually the primary meaning intended by the author was slightly different. It's not radically different, but it's slightly different. It comes from another root in Sanskrit, which actually literally means to meditate or to contemplate. And actually, therefore, in that sense, perhaps the more precise meaning within the Yoga Sutra is directly about meditation. And yet, that other root, to link, is also very important in the way that we understand it. So that actually by analysing words, analysing their derivations and looking at the range of possibilities, you get a very, very rich and broad tapestry of meaning. And I think that's something that when people first come to look at Indian texts, they don't necessarily appreciate. It's also a little bit contrary, I think, to the way that we tend to think of things in the West, whereby often we want to know which one is right. And I think, what's the absolute, what's the right? And actually what I think we've discovered over the years is that there's a kind of deliberate interplay, spectrum of meaning, and that brings a colour and a depth which I think can be extraordinary.
Thank you. Can I ask you a little bit about the writing process? Because writing a book together, it's more common in comedy routines, isn't it? So how did you you are a comedy routine, how did you practically write one seamless text between the two of you? What happened?
Go on.
Dave and I have been working together for a very, very long time. So we've been working together for 15 years. We've known each other for 25, 30 years.
We went to the same school.
And we found out later that we went to the same school.
We didn't know it at the time.
We didn't know it at the time. We had the same form master. He was in the year below me at school, Mr. Hiscott.
He's got a lot to answer for.
But I didn't know. We didn't know each other. And 10 years ago, 12 years ago, we started writing some small pamphlets, some small booklets. So we kind of done we've written 12 booklets on different aspects of yoga, and then we came to write our book. And when we did the rewrite, and we've come to wrote this Embodying the Yoga Sutra book, we basically divided up. We kind of brainstormed. We divided up some chapters. Yeah. Dave would write some chapters. I would write some chapters. And then we know each other very well, and we basically heavily critique or, question each other about each chapter. Went through the process, and then we attempted to skim over, but I don't know whether that's the right expression, but to somehow create a single narrative voice. Some people who have, it's not out, but some people who have read the book, who know us both very well, will probably know which bit I wrote or which bit Dave wrote. But hopefully it doesn't sound too. The idea was that it was a coherent, single authorial voice narrative.
And we could I kind of knew what Ranju was writing. And I think he would pretty much know what I would write. Yeah. So it kind of worked.
There were a few surprises.
There were a few surprises, but generally speaking, so we could navigate our way through this process without too much overlap. I think just because we've known each other for such a long time.
And we've also had such similar yogic background. We've been influenced in the same ways, so we've done a lot together.
It would be nice to hear a little bit more about the training and experience that you've had, each of you, in yoga. I know that you've shared teachers in common, and could you talk a little bit about that?
Do you want to say something?
You go first.
Okay, well, my father's Indian, my mother's English. Yoga was always kind of vaguely around. I had an Indian grandfather. He was very keen on yoga. As a teenager, I was, but I was kind of quite interested, vaguely backgroundy in yoga for a long time. I started going to yoga classes in my early 20s, and then at the same time I met a teacher who introduced me to a tradition of this man called TKV Desikachar. I'd been reading a book on Krishnamurti, and in the book, in this biography of Krishnamurti, it talked about this chap called Desikachar, who had been Krishnamurti's yoga teacher. In the hall that I was going to in Bristol, there was a little A4 poster, and it said, yoga in the tradition of TKV Desikachar, and he's not very well known, so I was just coincidentally went along to this class. I went to a retreat in August '87, I think, and he was on that retreat, weirdly. So that was where we started. And Desikachar was a very, very influential and very, very interesting teacher of yoga from South India. He sadly died a couple of years ago. But Desikachar was our teacher's teacher. We both went to India on a number of occasions to study with Desikachar, and directly with two of his main students, one in the UK, Paul Harvey, and one in France, Peter Hersnack. So we were very much kind of inducted into this tradition, and basically I had been an art therapist and family therapist working in the NHS, and my yoga career was kind of slowly getting more and more, and at some point I decided to see if I could be just a yoga teacher and stop the art therapy and the family therapy, and that's what I've been doing ever since. And Dave, you have a kind of similar story in some ways.
In some ways. My first exposure to yoga was actually, my dad had an LP of Lynn Marshall. I don't know whether you
Lynn Marshall,
remember
the Green Goddess.
The Green Goddess. Do you remember the Green Goddess?
Your dad had an LP?
He did.
I've never heard that before.
He did. And I'm not quite sure what I made of it, if I'm honest, at the time. But I went off to university, and for some reason I went to the yoga class, which I now realise in some respects was quite a strange type of class at the time, but it was enough to obviously prick my interest, and it's developed from there really. I'm an engineer by background, as was Jessica. I think there are, so I suppose one of the things that I've really appreciated about the yoga tradition and the Sanskrit tradition is there is a kind of rigorous logic to it, which kind of appeals to me actually.
Jessica wasn't airy-fairy, was he?
Not at all. No, not at all. No, it was very precise. And my yoga background, I guess, has followed a very similar course to Ranju's actually, because I fell into the same kind of tradition very, very early on. My first teacher was within this tradition, and that was, when I was 22, so 30 odd years ago. We've been walking along this path, and here we are.
Do you, could you talk a little about how you now are, so you've become the elder statesman now.
Really?
You've moved on to taking quite a senior role, and in transmitting this tradition. Desikachar is dead, and in coming to new audiences for this tradition, and particularly in the work that you do with your organisation Sadhana Mala. Could you tell us a little more about the kind of angle that you take on that? Because the world of yoga has really changed very radically, certainly in this country,
yes,
over the last 20 years. So what you might have been practicing in a church hall in Bristol in 80-something is not quite what's going on now. What is the focus of Sadhana Mala, your training organisation?
That's a good question. You're right that in the last 30 years, yoga has transformed beyond all recognition within the West, and there has been this kind of mushrooming of many, many different types of yoga, from the legendary goat yoga to beer yoga to yoga for this, yoga for that, and it's become extremely diverse. I was teaching a couple of years ago, and I was teaching in a retreat, and one of the people on the retreat was a GP. He was a doctor, and he was about my age, and he hadn't been doing yoga for 25 years. It was the first time he'd come back to doing yoga, but he had trained to be a yoga teacher 25 years ago, and at the same time as he was training to be a GP. And then, he became a GP, and then he had a family, and he's been GPing and familying for the last 25 years. So this was the first time he was coming back, and I was talking to him, and he said that he would be less likely to refer any of his patients to a yoga class now than he was 25 years ago. And I went, oh, why is that then? And he said, because you really don't know if I say somebody's coming with a back problem, say go and do yoga, you really don't know what it could be anything. There's such a big spectrum of what people get if they go to a yoga class. I think what we have endeavoured to teach in our teacher training courses and in the work that we do is a form of yoga which is very much based on traditional ideas, but focused around breath work, focused around adaptation for the individual, focused around a secular application of these traditional teachings, and hopefully interpreted in a very modern way. So it's not kind of dumbed down and void of... You see, one of the things that happens is that yoga just becomes a series of postures totally cut off from its philosophical roots, or it becomes philosophical roots in which you have to take on a whole ideology without a very practical way of doing it. And I hope what we've tried to do is to take the essence of the traditional ideas and then impart them to a contemporary, well, Western or East, to whoever, but certainly in a Western context. Just to make those traditional ideas, very user-friendly, practical, and embodiable. Yeah.
And the Yoga Sutra as a text is absolutely key to you, key in the tradition in which you're working, and key to the teaching that you're delivering. Could you just more generally tell us about how the Yoga Sutra sits as part of the work that you're doing?
This was explained to me by, I'm going to tell the Buddhist nun story now.
Yeah.
There's a Buddhist nun who I used to know quite well, and she was talking about the range of philosophy within Buddhism, obviously very related to yoga. And one of the things that she said, which I wasn't aware of, was that it was a very traditional idea that monks and nuns would essentially, they would learn and memorise a particular key text, not necessarily the whole range of texts, but one particular text would become their heart text, and it was like the foundation through which they would understand everything else. It wouldn't be that they wouldn't use other reference points, other texts, but that particular heart text which they became associated with was like the lens through which they would apply their practice, and they would understand the practice and understand everything else. And I think that expressed it so nicely about the way that we approach yoga and the place of the Yoga Sutra. Some historians have questioned the place of the Yoga Sutra as being central to the practice of yoga, but irrespective of that, for us, this was the foundation and this was the lens. And I think we've tried to continue that in the way that we're trying to present the ideas through our teaching and also through this book.
When you're thinking about the relevance of this text, so it's 2,000 years old.
Yeah.
It comes from often from a culture which is not the culture of the people that you're teaching, not always, but sometimes. What do you feel is the most important relevance of this particular text to the people that you're teaching? Why this one? There are some others to choose from, so some of you may know. There are many. Why?
One thing about the Yoga Sutra is that it is extremely process-driven rather than content-driven, in a sense. So what it does... So let's just say something about the idea of a sutra. A sutra links to the English word suture, which is a stitch. Sutras, everybody knows the Kama Sutra, but there are lots of different sutras, Nyaya Sutra, Sankhya Sutra, etc. Sutra is a form of writing in which a philosophy or a teaching is written in the most condensed form possible and written as a series of aphorisms, which are then meant to be memorized and chanted, etc. So the Yoga Sutra does not tell you how to practice yoga. What it does, it tells you in quite broad detail some of the aspects of the process of... It doesn't give you specific content, it tells you more about the process of practicing yoga and where you're going and what it's for and what obstacles might arise as you're going along this path and why things might become difficult and what sort of things you might do to ameliorate those difficulties without being too specific, giving you generalized ideas. For example, it says that the start of the yoga journey is that we're all suffering. Okay, we've all got... The reason why people get into yoga is because there's a problem. So it says this problem is... It describes as the word dukkha, and dukkha means this kind of restricted emotional space. We feel restricted. And then it says that just the first part of practicing yoga, there's three things that you've got to do. First thing is just to do something which challenges you at some level. Do something which challenges your habituated responses to things. So go against the grain a little bit. Now, going against the grain a little bit might just mean I'm not going to have that extra pudding, or I'm not going to have that. I'm going to cut down from 4 cups of coffee to 1 cup of coffee. Whatever, something like that. That is going against your habitual grain. That's the starting point for yoga. The second point is to reflect on reflect on yourself. Move closer to your, listen to yourself. And then the third part is trust. Okay? So do something that goes against the grain. Listen to yourself properly, and trust. And so, it's as vague and as specific as that. And then how you interpret, what does it mean to go against the grain? What does it mean to listen to yourself? What does it mean to trust? Those things can be then fleshed out in much more detail through your interaction with your teacher, or your own deepening involvement with the subject.
And you've just presented one sutra there.
Yep.
In those 3 ideas.
Chapter 2, Sutra 1.
Do you, the transmission of this material would traditionally have been oral, so would have been memorised. Do you still teach this material through chanting and memorisation, or is that something that you no longer
I think we're one of the few people who do, and there are a couple of people in the audience who we have flogged over a number of years. Well, no, I haven't flogged, but we have, Alice, for example, has learnt to chant the sutras. We're not going to ask you to chant the sutras
It'd be quite
publicly
nice. Would you all
right
like
now.
to hear it? Would you like to hear it? It's really impressive. Here we go. First 5.
Us to do it now.
Yeah, go on. It's worth listening to, huh?
You can join in.
Harmonies.
Harmonies.
From South London.
Harmonies from South London.
Go on in.
We'll do the first 12.
5.
Atta yoganushasanam yogaha chitta vritti nirodhaha tada drashtuhu svarupe avasthanam vritti sarupyam itaratra vrittaya panchataya klishtaha.
Would you like to tell the nice people what you just said?
Now the teaching of yoga begins.
Atta means now. Atta. So, and it's a bit like, amen as being the traditional ending. Atta is the traditional opening. So atta means now. Atta yoganushasanam. Now the teachings. Now follow the teachings, which is a kind of a double meaning.
It is, yeah.
Now, follow the teachings. Or now, the teachings of yoga follow, because this is the first sutra. So it's a kind of a double, it's a play. Atta yogana. Now, the teachings of yoga begin.
Yoga is a state of mind.
Yogaha chitta vritti nirodha. Yoga is a state of mind.
Which I think is very interesting in a modern context.
Yes.
That actually to say, yoga is actually nothing to do with the body in this definition. It's actually a state of mind.
Yeah. It's a state of mind in which yoga is which the mind is very focused.
You always do the next one. Then you feel more connected to yourself.
Yes. When you're in a state of yoga, when your mind is focused, everything's hunky-dory.
At other times, you simply identify with your projections.
And it's bad.
It's a bit miserable.
It's a bit miserable. When you think that, I mean, when I remember when I was working in the health service, I used to work in adult psychiatry, and sometimes I would get a referral from the GP saying, please would you see this very nice 23-year-old schizophrenic. And I always used to cringe at people saying, oh, you're a schizophrenic. It's like you are this.
Identify.
You are identified with this label. And I think that fourth sutra, oh my god, my mind's gone blank.
What Vritti Sarupam?
Vritti Sarupyam Itarachara. It means that at all other times when you're not in a state of yoga, you're identified with the contents of your mind. So when you say, I am depressed, I am happy, I am Tara, I am a yoga teacher, I am not a yoga teacher, I'm good at this, I'm not good at this. They're all just content. It's just content. It's just passing stuff. But when you kind of think, I am, that's what I am, then you're in a state of non-yoga. And it leads to misery because it actually solidifies and concretizes a sense of self around fleeting ideation. We didn't do the fifth sutra.
You what?
We didn't do the fifth sutra.
Oh no.
That's the first.
Well,
actually, interestingly,
the first four are important. Aren't they?
Interestingly, there's a traditional idea that the first four of the Yoga Sutras are, if you understand the first four, the other 191 you don't really need to know about because they're just the first four fleshed out in a lot of detail. In fact, some people...
And again, that's a tradition to do that, isn't it? And the first four verses of something is to lay out the essential message in the teaching. And if you could really embrace all of the implications of that, it's not just understanding the words, it's embracing all the implications.
Yeah.
And I think that's the thing, isn't it?
Yes.
That nothing else is necessary.
And we've even, I don't know whether it's a traditional idea or whether it's just we made this up. I'm not sure. Tell me, Dave. Did we
Go on.
Well, not only is it the first four sutras which embody the whole text, you could even boil it down to the first word, which really just embodies the whole text, and that word is atta, which is now. Eckhart Tolle very famously wrote a book called The Power of Now. The Yoga Sutra is basically the power of now in Sanskrit 2,000 years ago. It's now. It's about immediate presence.
And I think when people, I over the years, I thought a lot about, how relevant is this 2,000-year-old Sanskrit text from a very, very different culture to me, born and grew up in South London, no tangible connection with it really. And I always come back to the words of a very famous yoga scholar. He was one of the pioneers really, back in the 70s and 80s. There weren't many people studying yoga in those days, but probably the leading light of at the time, or one of the leading lights, was somebody called Georg Feuerstein. He was a German scholar, and he quite famously said, when people ask me, how can this text be relevant today? His answer, which I completely endorse, is people truly haven't changed. We are still suffering, we are still afraid, we are still anxious, we are still aspiring. The human condition truly has not changed. And the Yoga Sutra is really a text that strips away all of its cultural content, and it's about the nature of the human.
It's the human condition.
The human condition.
I just was drawn to a little sentence in your text, and I thought perhaps this would be a nice place to sort of round off this conversation. This is a quotation from the book. It is common to assume that yoga is a definitive, timeless and complete body of wisdom that has been transmitted faithfully without change since the dawn of time.
Discuss.
As a beginning yoga student, that is often what you're looking for, isn't it? Oh, I'm going to find out, finally, what the wisdom is. And I'm going to go, and these really august teachers who've been learning for years and years, they're going to tell me the correct interpretation of this great wisdom. And the rest of your chapter was quite interesting. So could you...
Well, the next line was nothing could be further from the truth.
Yes, that's right.
Because what you appreciate as you begin to explore the yoga tradition is how varied it's been over its long history, and how over its history in India all possibilities have been explored, and what yoga has come to mean for people has varied enormously over its long history. In fact, I mean, today I suppose the situation is even more extraordinary in the sense that yoga has mushroomed into all sorts of different forms. But I know that there's almost nothing that I could say about yoga. I don't think there is anything I could say about yoga that all yoga traditions, all yoga teachers would agree with. It is both incredibly diverse, and yet within that there is a kind of, there's something that seems to come through. I don't know whether that's kind of what you had in mind.
Yeah, I think in the diversity, so in thinking about producing a new book on the Yoga Sutras, you know, the yoga market, the yoga book market is fairly well peppered with Yoga Sutra translations and commentaries, right back from 2,000 years ago to the present moment. Why on earth would you want to write another one, except that this book seems really quite unusual to me. I'm fairly familiar with most of the existing work relating to the Yoga Sutra, and it seems to me that this is unique and unusual book because you have managed to literally embody the Yoga Sutra in the work that you're doing. That's to say, you've created practical material deeply linked to the text, not tangentially linked, not with a few nice
nods in the direction
yes, or a few sort of inspiring aphorisms printed at the beginning, but absolutely deeply entrenched in the text. And this is a really unusual book for that reason. And I was interested almost in asking you about this question of, it's a living work for you. So, for example, if we came back to you in 10 years' time, would you still be teaching exactly the same thing?
That's a good question. Yeah, I think that actually one of the quotes that we have from the book is that tradition is not like family heirlooms. Okay, so it's not like there's this antique heirloom which is handed down from generation to generation, and you say, you must look after this because this is your great-great-great-grandfather's or great-grandmother's thing, and it's the same thing which is just passed on from generation to generation. It's really not like that. And there's a nice image, a much better image, I think, is that each teacher is really a light which has the potential to enlighten or to light up the next generation of students, and they become teachers, and they've already got it within them. It's not that they have to learn a specific unchanging thing. I mean, having said that though, I mean, we have learned this specific unchanging text, the Yoga Sutra, which has been the same for the last 2,000 years. But the way we have interpreted it, the way we've understood it, the way we've embodied it, I think, is very relevant to this time. Whether it's the way we will be doing it in 10 years' time, I don't know. Because actually, to an extent, the Yoga Sutra is not an ancient text. It's a living. Yoga is not an ancient technique. It's a living thing which is about how we embody it, how we do it now. And it will be different in 10 years' time. And there will be some similarities, of course, but it's evolving every time we work together. And even if we teach the same thing, it
always comes out slightly different. It does. That is certainly true. And I think we have tried to navigate the path between tradition and innovation quite carefully. I think to innovate skillfully, you've got to know something very well. And I'm not claiming necessarily that we are the last word in that, but we've been going at it for quite a long time. And I kind of feel like we've got something to say in that way that is both relevant and has some roots. And I think to do those two things together is what keeps it alive, actually.
Peter said a really lovely thing which is very interesting. He said that one of the ideas in the Yoga Sutra is that we all have this thing called Purusha. Now, Purusha is that part of us, however you understand this, but Purusha is that part of us which is like, is the experiencer of everything that we experience, is Purusha. And Peter described Purusha as always the same, but always fresh. That's kind of a paradox, because we think of, if it's always the same, it's going to get stale. But always the same, but always fresh, seems to me a good way of understanding every single present moment. Because it's always the present moment, but it's always a fresh present moment. So I think the yoga is always the same, but always fresh.
It's the title of another book.
Start another book. Correct. Okay.
Thank you very much, both of you. We have a little time for questions, and a microphone, I think, will come to you.
Thank you so much for this wonderful discussion. One question I always ask myself while going through the Patanjali's Yoga Sutra, to my scientific mind, when he talks about all the siddhis that you can talk to, trees, plants, and animals, how do you reconcile with your scientific mind all of those sort of sutras?
Mm-hmm. So the Yoga Sutras are divided up into 4 books. The chapter 3 of the Yoga Sutra is entitled Vibhuti Pada, which is the chapter on what's called Vibhuti. Vibhuti are these strange, extraordinary powers which are the fruit of certain practices. So there are these ideas like you can walk on water, or you can be in 2 places at once and travel very far very quickly, or you can become very heavy, or you can float in the air. Basically, there's a whole bunch of these magical things, what are called siddhis. So that's the introduction, and now I'm going to pass you over to Dave to finish, because he knows what I'm going to say.
He's the scientist.
I was just thinking, I'm really pleased you're talking about it.
So go on.
No, you go
Sankhya.
first, and then I'll add something.
There's a sister philosophy of yoga. I mean, the idea of scientific. So there's a sister philosophy to the Patanjali's Yoga Sutra, which is basically the kind of core philosophy of many of the ancient Indian traditions, Sankhya, which I'm sure many of you will know about. Sankhya has its own understanding of how the world continues to be created afresh. And Sankhya reduces the whole of the phenomenal world to 25 principles, and one principle kind of gives birth to another principle, which gives birth to another principle. So it's kind of, it's kind of like an early periodic table, sort of. Sankhya has this, it's kind of like an early periodic table. And out of these 25 elements within the Sankhya system, basically, if you look at chapter 3 through the perspective of Sankhya, you can see that how the meditation on certain of these elements, if you take it in its logical conclusion, this is the result. This is where you will go with meditation if you understand the Sankhya system. So I think that chapter 3 is frankly strange, not very easy to teach, not very easy to understand, but it's more easily understood once you understand the Sankhya system and understand it as a self-referential system of kind of like, if you take on these ideas, this is its kind of logical conclusion. Now, whether those things are actually real or not, I don't know. But I do know that we can all develop extraordinary powers. Anybody who's really good at one thing develops extraordinary powers, which kind of other people will go, wow, that's impressive. How did you do that? That's really impressive. So I think the siddhis are really extraordinary powers which are in some ways almost theoretical extensions of the Sankhya philosophy. I don't really...
Well, I was just going to say something very basic actually, that actually one of the things that the Yoga Sutra suggests is that the possibility and potential of our minds, if we train it sufficiently, is extraordinary. I don't know whether I have not experienced these things. I'd love to have said I had, but I haven't. But I think it raises the possibility that the potential of the mind is a lot greater than we might think it is. And I'm quite happy to leave it at that, if I'm honest.
Work in progress.
Work in progress.
Flying is work in progress.
Hi. To what extent is this book prescriptive, or does it allow you to discover things for yourself?
To what extent is the book prescriptive?
Yep. And to what extent does it ask you to reconsider your perceptions, not to jump to conclusions? I'm trying to see whether there's any similarity between this.
Sorry,
to see whether there's any similarity between this and the Dhammapada, which stresses the way you think about the world and the need to change in order to perhaps find a direction in life and to change the way you feel.
Yeah, I think it's exactly that.
Sorry.
I think it's exactly what you've said.
Do you want to just say can you say that again? I don't know whether people at the back heard the question. So the question was, to what extent is this book prescriptive, or to what extent does it allow you to discover things? And secondly,
to reconsider your thinking, not jump to conclusions.
To what extent does it allow the person, or invite the person to reconsider their thinkings, not to jump to conclusions? Because the way you think would shape how you feel.
Yeah, I think it's exactly that, because I think what it attempts to do is to say some things about the way it was understood that the mind works. And in that process of describing how the mind works, then it asks you to really consider about how you are creating your experience, perhaps limiting your experience, and how you can open up your experience. And I think one of the things about the Yoga Sutra, as we've said, it's a process manual rather than a content manual. It invites you to find ways to work with your mind, rather than telling you, well, you have to do this, or you have to do that, or you have to do this. It just raises some possibilities about the mind, how the mind works, and then, in a sense, it gives some suggestions, but it's up to you to find the concrete ways to do it.
The other thing I'd also say in terms of this book is that in many yoga traditions say this is the way to do it. This is what real yoga is, and all other yoga is not real yoga. This is real yoga. What we're doing is real yoga. We've been through that. We've done that. We've said that, but we don't think that anymore, I don't think. And what we're now very keen to do is to step away from this is the true one path, which is sometimes the way we were taught, and we've been guilty of saying that. But I think now what we're saying is this is the way we have been taught. This is the way we have understood it. There are other paths. There are other ways of understanding it. This is what this word means. This is how we understand this word to mean. And so we've been as transparent as possible about what is interpretation, what is fact, and what is our understanding. And then, it's completely non-prescriptive. It's not saying you have to agree with us. It's fine. You may not agree with it, but at least you know what we think. Whether you agree with it or not, it's fine. That's how we understand it. And maybe it'll be different in 10 years' time. So.
There was a lady here.
Thank you. Hi. My question is about your teacher's teacher, Deshikachar, because the texts are great, but really the texts simply support living tradition. And very often with a teacher of that stature, their quirks actually embody yoga much more powerfully than an asana or a discourse. So I'm just wondering if you can share with us perhaps a quirk or two of Deshikachar that simply embodied the Yoga Sutra.
What a lovely question.
Desikachar's quirks, Dave?
I'm handing that one to you.
Didn't you tell me a nice story about him having a cup of coffee in a canteen with somebody? No?
I don't remember.
I'll say one thing about Desikachar, as somebody who was very, very learned, very, he had his father's teaching poured into him for years and years and years. One of the things that I would have said about Desikachar, well, two things actually I'll say. First thing, he was the epitome of acute observation. He could see things in people that nobody else could see. And in a way that was quite extraordinary. And I would say that was a trait of both Peter as well as Desikachar. I think one of the things I would say that linked the two of them actually, was their ability to see things in people and to sort of understand people and to relate to people. The other thing I was going to say particularly about Desikachar is that if he was around, you would not pick him out from anyone else.
His siddhi was invisibility.
He looked completely normal. You would go in the corner shop and you wouldn't even look at him twice. And that said something to me about him.
He was really the most unshowy yoga teacher. I mean, he was he just
in a world of yoga rock stars.
In a world of yoga rock stars, he was not a rock star, but in a really good way. In a really good way.
And yet, his ability to observe and to relate to people and to find common ground with people, I think, was extraordinary. And the same with Peter.
We've got time for one more question. Oh, where do we go?
Sorry, can I don't feel kind of, cognitive neurosciences as really understood Patanjali Yoga Sutra very well, or maybe there's no real kind of study being done about that. I'm very, very interested in dhyana and dharana, basically. And these days what you have is mindfulness meditation being plucked, really, and as I understand that's dhyana. How useful is it to just pluck dhyana and teach that as mindful meditation without actually going through the Ashtanga Yoga, the 8 limbs, so without understanding yam, niyam, and those profound philosophies, and really just plucking out that. And second, just very quick question, how do you draw a parallel between Raja Yoga, which is the chapter 9 of the Bhagavad Gita, as compared to Patanjali Yoga Sutra? Thank you very much.
It's mindfulness.
There was so the first question, Patanjali's Patanjali presents many different ideas within these 195 sutras. One of the major practices that he presents is what's called Ashtanga Yoga, which is 8 limbs of yoga. The last 3 of these limbs are sometimes grouped together and called samyama, and samyama is the progressive focusing on an object. Dharana, dhyana, and samadhi. Dharana is focusing your mind on one thing, and your mind will go off and you can't bring it back to this one thing. And it goes off and it bring it back. Goes off, bring it back. Dharana. Dhyana is when your mind is focused on that one thing in an unbroken fashion. Sometimes it's described as dharana is like water droplets. Specific, ding, ding, ding. Whereas dhyana is like pouring oil from one vessel to another. It's an unbroken, it's not distracted. So dhyana is sometimes translated as meditation. And dhyana arises from dharana. So a steady, fixed mind arises from a broken concentration. And then out of dhyana comes this third state, which is called samadhi. And samadhi is where there is a kind of a lack of any feeling of individual, but you don't, it's as if you're not there. It's as if you're not there. how does that relate to the mindfulness? There was an interesting article in The Guardian yesterday about what was called muck mindfulness. I don't know if anybody read it, but it's this idea that mindfulness has become massive over the last 10 years, and partly within the self-help and mental health services, it takes on a very useful, it's been a very useful tool. It's been very well packaged and marketed as completely devoid of any Buddhist or it's
philosophical or spiritual.
It's completely secular practice. So what they've done is taken some of the ideas of Buddhist meditation and used it within the realm of psychotherapy and basically to feel better. In the interesting article yesterday in The Guardian, there's this recent critique of that, which is if you take a practice out of context, then what that does is to simply enable practitioners of mindfulness to tolerate things that need changing better. So it's really a self-soothing technique which allows things to stay the same. And I think that's that's a valid criticism of mindfulness. I think it's a valid criticism of mindfulness, and taking it out of any kind of philosophical context is a valid criticism of mindfulness. Do you think mindfulness relates to, I mean, how would you say that it relates to Dharana, Dhyana, Samadhi?
Well, I mean, if I understood your question correctly, it was about the plucking of something out of a whole context and using it in isolation.
Yeah.
And I think one of the things about the Yoga Sutra, in fact, it's one of the sutras, Janma, it talks about different ways of coming to yoga. What appears to be recommended is the path of samadhi, which is a euphemism for the whole practice of yoga. And in that, it's important to be paripaka, I think was the term they used, cooked on all sides. And so
not like a barbecued sausage.
No. So we would thoroughly endorse that you need to be cooked on all sides.
Slowly.
Desakachara once said he felt the Yoga Sutra was like wearing out the sole of a shoe. You had to walk a lot of miles. It wasn't a quick fix. It was a kind of a long journey, and it has many aspects. And actually, personally, I think we all need to be cooked on all sides.
Thank you very much, Dave and Ranju. You've been listening to David Charlton and Ranju Roy talking about their